My husband left our child and me while there was an intruder in our house. My husband Troy always talked about being the man of the house. That's what husbands do, Lily. We protect our families. He'd puff out his chest at neighborhood barbecues, telling everyone how he'd handle any threat to his family. These criminals wouldn't know what hit them. October 15th, 2:47 a.m., glass breaking downstairs. I shook Troy awake. Someone's in the house. He sat up, listened. Our 4-year-old son Nate was sleeping between us because of nightmares. Troy grabbed his phone, then jumped out of bed. "I'm calling 911 from the car," he whispered. "What? What about us?" "I need to get help. Stay quiet." He was already pulling on his shoes. "Troy, don't leave us here. I'll be right outside. I can flag down the cops faster." He slipped out the bedroom door. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the back door opening, his car starting. He drove away. I grabbed Nate, locked us in the bathroom, and called 911 myself while someone ransacked our living room. The intruder left after taking our TV and my grandmother's jewelry. Police arrived 12 minutes later. Troy pulled up right behind them. "Thank God you're safe," he said, hugging me in front of the officers. "Smart thinking, getting back up," one cop told him. Troy nodded like he'd orchestrated the whole response. The next morning, he explained his strategy over breakfast. "Listen, Lily. One person needed to get to safety to ensure help arrived. Basic survival tactics. You left your son. To save him. What if I'd stayed and the guy came upstairs? Then we'd all be victims. I made the tactical choice. The coward's choice. Don't be emotional about this. Men think strategically. Women just react." When my sister asked what happened, Troy told her, "I coordinated with law enforcement while Lily panicked in the bathroom." At his brother's house, he became the hero who outsmarted a burglar. You have to think 3 steps ahead in these situations. I started taking self-defense classes. Troy laughed. "Lily's learning karate now. Guess she doesn't trust me to protect her." "Exactly right," I said. He stopped laughing. I installed new locks, security system, motion lights. Troy complained about the expense. "We already got robbed once. Lightning doesn't strike twice." I bought a baseball bat for the bedroom. Troy moved it to the garage. "You'll hurt yourself swinging that around." I moved it back. I taught Nate our new safety plan. If anything happens, we go to the bathroom, lock the door, call 911. We practiced until he knew it perfectly. Troy called it paranoid. You're scaring the kid with your doomsday prep. 3 years passed. I kept training. Troy kept talking. He'd retell the burglar story at every gathering, each version making him more heroic. I had to make a split-second decision to save my family. Meanwhile, he'd gained 40 pounds and couldn't run up our stairs without wheezing. His idea of home security was leaving the porch light on. Last month, Troy was staying at his brother Keith's house while Keith was traveling. Just Troy alone, watching the place. 3 a.m., someone broke in through the sliding door. Troy called me, whispering, panicked. "Lily, someone's in Keith's house. I'm in the bedroom. What do I do?" "Call 911. "I can't. They'll hear me." "Can you call for me?" "Where's your tactical thinking, Troy? This isn't funny. I'm scared." "Just get to your car. Flag down the cops yourself." "I can't get to the car. They're downstairs." One person needs to get to safety to ensure help arrives. Remember? Basic survival tactics. Lily, please. Men think strategically. Don't be emotional about this. Are you seriously doing this right now? I'm 3 steps ahead like you taught me. The intruder took Keith's golf clubs and laptop while Troy hid in a closet for 40 minutes. He called 911 himself eventually, whisper crying to the dispatcher. Keith's security camera caught Troy sneaking out the back window after the burglar left, falling into the bushes, Army crawling to hide behind the trash cans until police arrived. Keith sent me the footage. I didn't share it anywhere, didn't need to. Troy's own retelling gave him away. The guy was huge, probably armed. I had to wait for the right moment. "Just like you waited for the right moment with us?" I asked. "That was different." "How?" "I had a plan then." "What was the plan, Troy? Drive away and hope we figured it out?" He started sleeping on the couch after that. Then the unexpected happened. Troy cleared his throat from the couch where he'd been sleeping for the past week. I was making breakfast for Nate when Troy appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing the same shirt he'd had on yesterday. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. I poured milk into Nate's cereal bowl and didn't look up. Troy shifted his weight and scratched his stomach through his wrinkled shirt. He opened his mouth twice before any words came out. He said he'd been thinking about our marriage and believed we should try counseling to work through this rough patch. I set the milk carton down harder than I meant to. The word rough patch hung in the air between us like he'd just described a minor disagreement about paint colors. Nate looked up from his cereal with milk dripping off his spoon. Troy kept talking about how all marriages go through difficult times, and the mature thing would be to get professional help. I stared at him standing there in his dirty shirt, acting like I was the one with the problem. He said a good counselor could help us communicate better and understand each other's perspectives. I turned off the stove and faced him fully for the first time in days. My voice came out flat and cold when I told him there was nothing to work through. He was a coward who abandoned his family twice, and I was done pretending otherwise. Troy's face went red and he pushed off from the doorframe. He said I was being dramatic about tactical decisions he made under pressure. His voice got louder as he explained again how we had to think strategically in dangerous situations. I told Nate to take his cereal to his room and watch cartoons. Nate grabbed his bowl and left without arguing because even at 4 years old he could feel the tension. Troy followed me as I walked to the living room. He kept saying I didn't understand how men had to make hard choices to protect their families. I picked up his pillow from the couch and threw it at him. It hit his chest and fell to the floor between us. I said the only thing he protected was himself, and I was finished listening to his excuses. The next morning, I waited until Troy left for work before I called Lorraine. My hands shook as I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, and I said 3 words. I want a divorce. Lorraine didn't ask if I was sure or tell me to think about it. She said she'd be right over and hung up. 30 minutes later, her car pulled into my driveway. She came through the front door carrying a notebook and her purse. We sat at my kitchen table and she pulled out a business card for Richard Hernandez. Her friend had used him for her divorce 2 years ago and said he was tough but fair. Lorraine opened her notebook and started writing. She asked about our mortgage and I told her we still owed about $200,000. She asked about bank accounts and I explained we had one joint checking account and separate savings accounts. She asked about my job and I told her I made decent money as an office manager. She wrote everything down in neat columns. She asked if Troy had ever hit me and I said no. She asked if he'd ever threatened me and I said no. She asked what grounds I had for divorce and I laughed without any humor in it. Abandonment felt too dramatic, but it was the truth. Lorraine kept writing and asking questions. Did we have any property besides the house? Did Troy have retirement accounts through his work? Did I have documentation of his income? I answered everything while Nate played with blocks in the living room. We made a list of every document I would need to gather. Pay stubs from the last 6 months. Tax returns from the last 3 years. Mortgage statements and utility bills. Bank statements going back a year. Lorraine circled the word evidence at the top of one page. She asked if I had anything that showed Troy's character or fitness as a parent. I thought about Keith's security footage sitting in my email. Lorraine's eyes got sharp when I mentioned it. She said I needed to bring that to the attorney along with everything else. 3 days later, I sat in Richard Hernandez's office with a folder full of papers on my lap. His office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown with gray carpet and white walls. Richard was younger than I expected with dark hair and glasses. He shook my hand and gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat down and put my folder on his desk. He opened it and started looking through the mortgage papers and bank statements. I had printed out my pay stubs and Troy's too since I had access to our joint email. Richard looked at each page carefully without saying anything. After a few minutes, he looked up and asked me to tell him what happened. I started with the first break-in 3 years ago, when Troy left Nate and me alone. Richard listened without interrupting or taking notes. I told him about the 3 years after and how Troy kept lying about what happened. I told him about Keith's house and the closet and the security footage. Richard's expression didn't change through any of it. When I finished, he took off his glasses and cleaned them with his shirt. He said my case was straightforward since there was no abuse to prove just irreconcilable differences. The words sounded clinical and cold, but also exactly right. Richard put his glasses back on and asked about custody. I said I wanted primary custody of Nate. He nodded and made a note on his legal pad. He asked if I thought Troy would fight for custody, and I said probably not if it required actual effort. Richard leaned back in his chair and asked if I had any evidence of Troy's character that might help with custody arrangements. I mentioned Keith's security footage again. Richard's whole face changed. His eyes got brighter and he sat forward. He said documentation of a parent's inability to protect a child could be relevant in custody decisions. He asked if I could get a copy of the full video file. I told him Keith had already sent it to me. Richard asked me to forward it to his email address immediately. He said it wouldn't prove Troy was a bad father, but it would establish a pattern of behavior that contradicted his claims about being a protector. I pulled out my phone right there in his office and forwarded the email from Keith. Richard's computer dinged a few seconds later. He opened the video and watched the whole thing without saying a word. When Troy fell into the bushes, Richard's mouth twitched like he was trying not to smile. When the video ended, Richard closed his laptop and looked at me. He said we had a strong case for primary custody with Troy getting standard visitation. He explained the timeline for filing. It would take about a week to prepare the paperwork, and then Troy would be served. Richard said I should expect Troy to be angry and possibly vindictive. I told Richard that Troy had been sleeping on our couch for a week and barely spoke to me. Richard said that would probably change once Troy got served with papers. I left Richard's office feeling lighter than I had in months. I sat in my car in the parking garage and called Keith. He answered after 3 rings, sounding tired. I explained that I needed the security footage for my divorce attorney. Keith was quiet for a second and then said he was sorry it had come to that. I told him it had come to that 3 years ago, I just hadn't accepted it yet. Keith said he'd send me the full video file from his security system. I thanked him and was about to hang up when he spoke again. He said he was sorry Troy turned out this way. His voice had real sadness in it, like he'd lost something too. I told him it wasn't his fault his brother was a coward. Keith laughed, but it sounded hollow. He said he'd send the video within the hour. I thanked him again and hung up. My phone buzzed 50 minutes later with an email from Keith. The video file was attached along with a short message. The message said he hoped I got everything I deserved in the divorce, and that Nate was lucky to have me as his mom. I sat in my car and cried for the first time since this whole thing started. Troy came home from work at his usual time that Thursday. I had picked up Nate from daycare and fed him dinner. Nate was watching cartoons in the living room. I heard Troy's car in the driveway and my heart started pounding. The divorce papers were on the kitchen counter where I'd left them that morning. I heard Troy's key in the lock and the front door opening. He called out that he was home like this was a normal day. I didn't answer. I heard him walk through the living room and ruffle Nate's hair. Then his footsteps came toward the kitchen. I was standing by the sink washing Nate's plate. Troy walked in and saw the papers immediately. He stopped in the doorway. The papers were in a manila envelope with his name written on the front. Troy picked up the envelope and opened it. He pulled out the papers and started reading. I kept washing the plate even though it was already clean. Troy read in silence for what felt like 10 minutes. Then he looked at me with genuine shock on his face, like he never believed I'd actually do it. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked back down at the papers and flipped through them. His hands were shaking slightly. He set the papers down on the counter and pressed his palms flat against the surface. He asked if I was serious about this. I turned off the water and dried my hands. I told him I'd never been more serious about anything in my life. Troy tried the guilt approach first. He said I was breaking up our family over one mistake. His voice got soft and pleading. He asked what about Nate growing up without his father. He said kids need both parents and I was being selfish. I turned around and looked at him directly. I reminded him that he already chose to leave Nate during a home invasion, so he made that decision himself. Troy's face changed from sad to defensive. He said that wasn't fair, and I was twisting what happened. I asked him which time I was twisting. The first break-in when he drove away, or the second one when he hid in a closet for 40 minutes. Troy's jaw clenched and his hands curled into fists on the counter. He said those were completely different situations, and I knew it. I asked how they were different. He didn't have an answer for that. Troy switched tactics and got angry. His face turned red and he pushed away from the counter. He said I was cold and unforgiving. He said real wives support their husbands through difficult times. His voice got louder as he said I was abandoning him when he needed me most. He said I was heartless and cruel. He said I never appreciated anything he did for this family. He listed all the ways he'd provided for us over the years. The mortgage payments and the car insurance and the groceries. Like money was the same thing as courage. Like paying bills made up for leaving his son in danger. I let him yell until he ran out of steam. When he finally stopped talking, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of cartoons from the other room. I stayed completely calm and told him I supported him for years while he took credit for my work, and lied about his courage. I said the difficult time he was experiencing now was just reality catching up with his lies. Troy stared at me like I'd slapped him. I told him I called 911 myself during the first break-in while he sat in his car. I told him I installed the security system and bought the bat and took the self-defense classes. I told him I taught Nate our safety plan while Troy complained about the expense. I said I did everything to protect our family while he told everyone he was the hero. Troy's face went from red to pale. He picked up the divorce papers and walked out of the kitchen. I heard him go upstairs and slam the bedroom door. 20 minutes later, he came back down with a duffel bag full of clothes. He walked past me without saying anything and left through the front door. His car started in the driveway and pulled away. Nate came into the kitchen and asked where Daddy went. I told him Daddy was going to stay at Uncle Keith's house for a while. Nate shrugged and asked if he could have a snack. I gave him an apple and watched him walk back to his cartoons like nothing had changed. 2 days later, Keith's truck pulled up in the driveway just after dinner. I watched from the living room window as Troy loaded garbage bags full of his clothes into the bed. He made 3 trips back and forth, each time moving slower like he hoped I might come outside and stop him. I stayed exactly where I was. Nate pressed his face against the window next to me and watched his father carry boxes to the truck. Troy looked up once and saw us both standing there. He raised his hand in a small wave. Nate waved back. Troy stood there for another minute like he was waiting for something, then climbed into the passenger seat. Keith backed out of the driveway and the truck disappeared down the street. The house felt different immediately. Not sad or empty, just lighter somehow. Like someone had opened all the windows and let fresh air sweep through every room. I made hot chocolate for Nate and we sat at the kitchen table together. He swung his legs under his chair and asked where Daddy went. I told him Daddy was going to stay at Uncle Keith's house for a while. Nate nodded and took a sip of his hot chocolate. He asked if Daddy was coming back tomorrow. I said no, not tomorrow. Nate thought about this for a moment, then asked if he could watch cartoons before bed. I said yes, and he ran off to the living room, leaving his empty mug on the table. The next afternoon, Lorraine showed up with a bag from the hardware store. She dumped the contents on my kitchen counter and 3 new deadbolts clattered across the surface. She said Richard told her it was fine to change the locks as long as I gave Troy access when he asked for his stuff. I picked up one of the deadbolts and turned it over in my hands. Lorraine grabbed a screwdriver from the junk drawer and headed for the front door. I followed her and held the instruction sheet while she removed the old lock. The screws came out easily and the whole mechanism fell into her hands. She tossed it in the trash and lined up the new deadbolt. I read the instructions out loud and she worked quickly, drilling new holes where they were needed. Within 20 minutes, the front door had a shiny new lock that Troy's key would never open. We moved to the back door next, then the door from the garage into the house. Lorraine tested each lock 3 times to make sure it worked smoothly. She handed me the new keys and I slipped them onto my keyring. She said it felt good to do something practical after all the legal paperwork. I agreed and thanked her for coming over. She said that's what sisters do, then asked if I wanted her to stay for dinner. I told her I needed to talk to Nate alone tonight. After Lorraine left, I found Nate building a tower with his blocks in the living room. I sat down on the floor next to him and helped him add pieces to the top. He concentrated hard on making it perfectly straight. When the tower was as tall as his shoulder, I told him I needed to talk to him about something important. He looked at me with his big eyes and waited. I said Mommy and Daddy were going to live in different houses now. He asked if Daddy was mad at us. I said no, Daddy wasn't mad, but sometimes grown-ups decide they're happier living apart. Nate asked if he did something wrong. My chest tightened and I pulled him into my lap. I said he didn't do anything wrong at all and both Mommy and Daddy love him very much. He was quiet for a minute, then asked if he could bring his toys to both houses. I promised him yes. He could take whatever toys he wanted to Daddy's house and back home again. He seemed satisfied with this answer and wiggled out of my lap to keep building. He added 3 more blocks to his tower before asking if he could have macaroni for dinner. I said yes and got up to start cooking. Troy's mother called while I was draining the pasta. Her voice came through the phone already crying. She said I was destroying her son and breaking up the family over nothing. She said Troy made one mistake and I was punishing him forever. She said Nate needed his father in the house and I was being selfish. I held the phone away from my ear and poured the macaroni into a bowl. She kept talking about how hard Troy worked to provide for us, and how ungrateful I was. She said her son deserved better than a wife who gave up on their marriage. I let her talk for exactly 2 minutes while I stirred butter into Nate's macaroni. When she called me selfish for the 3rd time, I said I had to go and hung up. The phone rang again immediately. I turned it off and brought Nate his dinner. 3 days later, I walked into the gym for my regular class. Kira was setting up the training mats and looked up when I came in. She smiled and said I looked different somehow. I asked what she meant, and she said I seemed lighter, like a weight had lifted off my shoulders. I dropped my bag by the wall and told her I filed for divorce. Kira's face broke into a huge grin, and she crossed the mat in 3 long steps. She held up her hand for a high five, and I smacked my palm against hers. The sound echoed through the empty gym. She said it was about time and asked how I felt. I said I felt free for the first time in years. Kira said she could tell, and that I'd been carrying Troy's fear around like it was my own. Other students started arriving, and we began the warm-up, but I couldn't stop smiling. During partner drills, I moved faster and hit harder than I had in months. Kira noticed and called out encouragement across the mat. After class, she asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I said yes, and we exchanged numbers. Richard called 4 days after that while I was making lunch. He said Troy hired an attorney and filed a response to the divorce petition. I asked what it said, and Richard explained that Troy was requesting joint custody with equal parenting time. He asked if I was comfortable with that arrangement given Troy's history. I said absolutely not. I told Richard I wanted primary custody with Troy getting supervised visitation at first. Richard asked if I had specific concerns about Troy's parenting. I reminded him about the break-in and how Troy left me and Nate alone in the house. I said Troy had never been alone with Nate for more than a few hours, and I didn't trust him to keep our son safe. Richard said those were valid concerns and he would draft a custody proposal. He said to expect Troy's attorney to push back hard. The letter arrived 6 days later. Richard called and read it to me over the phone. Troy's attorney called my custody request unreasonable and said it showed I was trying to alienate Nate from his father. The letter threatened to bring up my security measures as evidence of my unstable mental state. It said my paranoia about home safety demonstrated an inability to think rationally. Richard laughed while he read that part. I asked what was funny, and he said this strategy was going to backfire badly on Troy's attorney. He explained that my security preparations showed responsible parenting, especially since we actually were robbed. Richard said he would respond with documentation of everything I'd done to protect our family while Troy did nothing. I spent the next 2 days gathering evidence. I pulled out receipts for the security system, the new locks, the motion lights. I found my records from the self-defense classes showing 3 years of consistent training. I wrote down the safety plan I taught Nate and how we practiced it together. I documented the baseball bat Troy tried to hide in the garage. I made copies of the police report from our break-in. I printed out emails where Troy complained about the expensive security measures. I put everything in a folder and dropped it off at Richard's office. He flipped through the pages and nodded with approval. He said this painted a clear picture of a mother who took reasonable steps to protect her child while the father dismissed her concerns. He said Troy's attorney just handed us the custody case. 2 months crawled by with lawyers exchanging letters and filing motions. Richard kept me updated on every development but said we needed to wait for the mediation date. Finally, the notice arrived in the mail. We had a mediation session scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I took the day off work and dropped Nate at Lorraine's house. I arrived at the mediator's office 15 minutes early and sat in my car rehearsing what I wanted to say. Richard pulled up right on time and we walked in together. The waiting room had gray carpet and uncomfortable chairs. Troy was already there in a suit that looked new. He sat up straight with his hands folded on his lap, trying to look confident. His attorney sat next to him reviewing papers. The mediator called us into the conference room and we all took seats around a long table. The mediator introduced herself and explained how the process would work. She said we were here to discuss custody arrangements and hopefully reach an agreement. She looked at Troy and asked him to explain his position. Troy launched into a speech about being an involved father who wanted equal time with his son. The mediator listened and made notes. Then she looked up and asked Troy to explain the security footage from Keith's house. Troy's face went pale and his confident expression cracked. He glanced at his attorney, who looked just as surprised by the question. Troy cleared his throat and said the incident at Keith's house was taken out of context. He said he made a strategic decision to wait for the right moment to call for help. The mediator cut him off and asked why he didn't call for help from inside the closet. Troy stammered and said he was afraid the intruder would hear him. The mediator asked if he had his phone with him in the closet. Troy said yes. The mediator asked why he didn't text for help or use any silent method to contact police. Troy's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear. Troy's shoulders slumped. The mediator pulled out her folder of documents and flipped through several pages of my security preparations. She asked Troy directly why he moved the baseball bat from the bedroom to the garage. Troy shifted in his chair and repeated his earlier claim about me hurting myself with it. The mediator wrote something on her notepad that made Troy's attorney close his eyes briefly and shake his head. Richard caught my eye and gave the tiniest nod. The mediator asked several more questions about my self-defense training, the security system installation, and the safety plan I taught Nate. Troy tried to interrupt twice to explain his perspective, but his attorney touched his arm to stop him. After 90 minutes of questioning, the mediator announced we would break for lunch and reconvene at 1 o'clock. Richard and I walked to a sandwich shop 2 blocks away. He ordered a turkey club and I got a salad I barely touched. Richard told me the mediation was going extremely well from our perspective. Troy's credibility was destroyed and his attorney knew it. Richard expected them to accept my custody terms rather than risk going to court where a judge would hear about Keith's security footage and Troy's pattern of abandoning his family during emergencies. He said Troy's attorney was competent enough to recognize a losing position when he saw one. I asked what would happen if Troy refused to accept reasonable terms. Richard said we would go to court, present all our evidence, and let a judge decide, but he was confident Troy's attorney would advise against that strategy. We finished eating and walked back to the mediator's office. Troy and his attorney were already in the waiting room when we arrived. Troy wouldn't look at me. The mediator called us back into the conference room at 1:15. Before she could start speaking, Troy's attorney requested a private conversation with Richard. The 2 lawyers stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind them. Troy stared at the table. I sat perfectly still and waited. The mediator made notes on her laptop. 20 minutes passed in near silence except for the sound of her typing. Finally, the door opened and both attorneys returned. Troy's attorney looked resigned as he sat down next to his client. Richard took his seat next to me with a completely neutral expression. Troy's attorney announced they would accept primary custody with me and standard visitation for Troy. Troy's face went red and he started to protest, but his attorney cut him off with a firm look. The mediator asked if both parties agreed to move forward with custody arrangements. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I said yes immediately. Troy hesitated for several long seconds before his attorney whispered something to him, and he finally nodded. The mediator pulled out a calendar and started working out a visitation schedule. She proposed Troy would get Nate every other weekend from Friday evening until Sunday evening, plus 1 weeknight dinner visit per week. Troy tried to argue that he wanted more time, that he deserved equal custody as Nate's father. His attorney leaned close and spoke quietly but firmly in his ear. Troy's jaw clenched, but he stopped arguing. The mediator asked me if the proposed schedule was acceptable. I said yes, as long as Troy picked up and dropped off Nate on time and gave me 24 hours notice if he needed to cancel a visit. The mediator added those conditions to the agreement. She typed everything up on her laptop and printed 2 copies for us to review. Richard read through the entire document carefully before sliding it over to me. I scanned the pages and everything looked correct. Troy signed his copy without reading it. I signed mine and dated it at the bottom. The mediator collected both documents and said she would file them with the court by the end of the week. Walking to my car after the mediation, I felt something lift from my chest that I didn't even know I was carrying. Troy's lies finally caught up with him in a way he couldn't talk his way out of. A mediator and his own attorney heard him try to justify abandoning his family and removing safety equipment from our home. They saw through every excuse and strategic explanation he offered. The custody arrangement gave me exactly what I wanted, while Troy got the minimum standard visitation that any non-custodial parent receives. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, just breathing and letting the reality sink in. My phone buzzed with a text from Lorraine asking how it went. I texted back that I got primary custody and would tell her everything later. She responded immediately with 3 champagne glass emojis and said she was taking me out to celebrate. Lorraine picked me up at 7 that evening and drove us to a nice restaurant downtown with cloth napkins and actual wine glasses instead of the cheap ones we usually drank from at home. We ordered a bottle of wine and clinked our glasses together. Lorraine told me she was proud of how strong I had become over the past few years. She said watching me take self-defense classes and install security systems and finally stand up to Troy's manipulation showed real courage. I told her I didn't feel particularly courageous. I just got tired of being scared and started doing something about it. She said that's exactly what courage is. We talked about the mediation and laughed about Troy's attorney trying to use my security preparations against me. Lorraine said any reasonable person would see those as responsible parenting choices, especially after we were actually robbed. I realized she was right about something else too. I wasn't the same person who married Troy 7 years ago. That version of me believed his stories about being the man of the house and protecting his family. This version knew the truth and refused to pretend otherwise. Troy exercised his first visitation weekend 2 weeks later. He arrived at 6 o'clock on Friday evening to pick up Nate. Our son came downstairs with his little backpack full of toys and his favorite stuffed elephant. Nate hugged me goodbye and walked out to Troy's car without any hesitation or concern. Troy loaded the backpack into his trunk and drove away. I watched until his taillights disappeared around the corner. The house felt strange without Nate's constant noise and energy. I made myself dinner and ate it at the kitchen table instead of on the couch like I usually did when Troy still lived here. After dinner, I deep cleaned the entire downstairs, scrubbing the kitchen floor on my hands and knees, and wiping down every surface in the living room. Saturday morning, I cleaned the upstairs bathrooms and vacuumed all the bedrooms. I washed every window in the house until they sparkled. I reorganized the closets and threw away 3 garbage bags of Troy's old clothes and belongings that he never came back for. By Sunday afternoon, the house felt completely mine in a way it never had before. Troy returned Nate on Sunday evening at 6 o'clock exactly. Nate burst through the front door talking about playing video games all weekend and eating pizza for dinner both nights, and staying up past his bedtime to watch cartoons. Troy stood in the doorway looking exhausted. His shirt had a stain on the front, and his hair stuck up in odd directions. I asked if everything went okay. Troy said it was fine, just tiring. I realized he had never actually had to parent alone for 2 full days before. When we were married, I handled all of Nate's meals and bedtime routines and entertainment while Troy watched television or worked on his laptop. Now he was discovering what it actually meant to be responsible for a 4-year-old child without anyone to help. Nate ran upstairs to put his toys away. Troy lingered in the doorway for a moment like he wanted to say something, then just turned and walked back to his car. I closed the door and locked it behind him. 3 months into our separation, Richard called to discuss the financial negotiations. He explained that we needed to decide what to do about the house. The options were for me to buy out Troy's half of the equity, sell the house and split the proceeds, or let Troy buy out my half. He asked which option I preferred. I said I wanted to keep the house if possible. This was where Nate grew up and where all his friends lived and where he felt safe. Richard said he would get the house appraised and calculate how much I would need to pay Troy for his share. He warned me that it might be expensive and asked if I had savings or access to funds. I told him I had been setting aside money for the past 3 years, ever since Troy abandoned us during the first break-in. Richard said he would send me the numbers once he had them, and we could decide how to proceed. I met with a financial advisor the following week at her office downtown. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. I brought all my financial documents, including bank statements, pay stubs, and information about my retirement accounts. She reviewed everything carefully and asked questions about my monthly expenses and income. After about 40 minutes of calculations, she looked up and told me I could afford to buy out Troy's half if I refinanced the mortgage. The monthly payments would be higher than what I was paying now, but still manageable on my salary. She said the house would be entirely mine with no ties to Troy remaining. I asked her to walk me through the refinancing process and what documents I would need. She printed out a checklist and explained each step. I left her office with a folder full of papers and a clear plan for moving forward. The house would be mine. Completely mine. No more shared property or financial connections to the man who drove away and left his family behind. Richard called me 2 days later with news that Troy's attorney had responded to the buyout offer. Troy was refusing to sign. Richard read me the letter over the phone where Troy's attorney claimed the house belonged to both of them equally, and I couldn't force him out of his own property. I asked Richard what our options were. He explained that we could take it to court and force a sale where neither of us would get what we wanted, or we could wait for Troy to realize he had no better choice. Richard said he would call Troy's attorney and explain the reality of the situation in terms Troy couldn't ignore. The next morning, Richard scheduled a conference call with Troy's attorney present. Richard laid out the numbers showing that forcing a sale would cost both of us thousands in realtor fees and closing costs. He explained that my offer gave Troy fair market value for his half with none of the hassle or expense. Troy's attorney put us on hold for 10 minutes while he talked to Troy privately. When they came back on the line, Troy's attorney said his client would accept the buyout terms. I heard Troy's voice in the background saying something about not having a choice, and his attorney quickly muted their end. Richard told them he would draft the paperwork and send it over for review by end of week. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table feeling like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in months. I called the bank that afternoon to start the refinancing process. The loan officer walked me through the application and scheduled an appraisal for the following week. She said the process would take about 6 weeks from start to finish. I gathered every document she requested and organized them in a folder that night. The appraisal happened on a Tuesday morning. The appraiser spent 2 hours measuring rooms and taking photos while I waited in the kitchen drinking coffee. He left without telling me the results, but the bank called 3 days later to say the house appraised for exactly what we needed. My refinancing application moved forward. Richard sent me the buyout paperwork to review. I read every page twice, checking that all the terms matched what we agreed on. Troy's portion would be paid from my refinancing proceeds the day we closed. His name would be removed from the deed and the mortgage. The house would be mine alone. I signed the papers and sent them back to Richard. Troy signed his copies at his attorney's office the same day. 4 months after filing for divorce, I sat in the bank's conference room signing my name on what felt like 100 different pages. The loan officer explained each document as I signed. The final paper was the deed showing my name as the sole owner. She stamped it with her notary seal and handed me a copy. I walked out of the bank holding that deed and got in my car before I let myself cry. They were good tears, the kind that come when something you worked for finally happens. I drove straight to Lorraine's house and showed her the deed. She hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe and said she was proud of me. I called Kira from Lorraine's driveway and told her the house was officially mine. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. That Saturday evening, Lorraine and Kira came over with 2 bottles of wine and a cake that said, "Congratulations," in blue frosting. We sat in my living room now, and toasted to new beginnings. Kira asked if it felt different knowing the house was completely mine. I said it felt lighter somehow, like a weight I didn't know I was carrying had finally lifted. Lorraine laughed and said Troy probably thought I couldn't manage the mortgage payments without him. Kira said she hoped he was somewhere right now realizing how wrong he was about me. We finished both bottles of wine and most of the cake. They left around midnight and I walked through every room of the house turning off lights. Each room felt more mine than it ever had before. Nate adjusted to our new routine faster than I expected. He had his own room here and a smaller room at Troy's apartment. He never complained about going back and forth. I noticed he seemed calmer during the weeks after Troy moved out. The tension that used to fill our house when Troy was home had disappeared. Nate stopped having nightmares about bad guys breaking in. He slept through the night in his own bed without needing to come sleep between us. One morning while I was making his breakfast, he told me he liked it better when it was just us at home. I asked him why, and he said the house felt happier now. He never once asked when Daddy was coming back to live with us. 3 weeks after the house became officially mine, Troy picked up Nate for his weekend visit. He stood in the doorway longer than usual while Nate ran to get his backpack. Troy mentioned casually that he had started seeing someone new. Her name was Jennifer, and she worked at his office. I told him that was nice, and I hoped it worked out for him. His face did this weird thing where his smile froze and then fell. He had clearly expected a different reaction. He said Jennifer was really great and they had a lot in common. I said that sounded wonderful, and asked if he needed anything else because I had plans. He left looking confused and slightly annoyed. Nate came back with his backpack and gave me a hug before running out to Troy's car. The next week was Nate's parent-teacher conference at his preschool. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the hallway waiting for my turn. Troy was supposed to come, but he texted an hour before saying he couldn't make it because of work. The teacher called me in, and we sat at a small table covered with Nate's artwork. She pulled out a folder of his schoolwork and showed me his progress. Then she smiled and said Nate talked about me constantly in class. She said he told all the other kids that his mommy was really strong and could fight bad guys. He had announced during circle time that I could fix anything that broke in our house. The teacher said she had never seen a child so proud of their parent. My eyes filled with tears and I had to look down at the table for a minute. She handed me a tissue and said I was clearly doing something very right. I thanked her and left the conference feeling like my heart might burst. 6 months after I filed for divorce, Richard called me on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. He said the divorce was final. The judge had signed the papers and it was officially done. I was no longer married to Troy. I thanked Richard for everything he had done and hung up the phone. I stood in my bedroom holding my phone and waiting to feel something big. Instead, I just felt relief, like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. I went to work and had a completely normal day. That evening, I cooked dinner for Nate and helped him with a puzzle. We watched a cartoon before bedtime and I tucked him in like always. Nothing felt different because my life had already changed months ago, when I decided to stop accepting Troy's version of reality. 3 months later, Troy called me on a Saturday afternoon. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow. He said Jennifer had broken up with him the week before. He wanted to talk about us and what we used to have together. I told him there was no us anymore, and there hadn't been for a long time. He said we had good years together before everything went wrong. I reminded him that we had a marriage where he lied constantly about who he was and what he had done. I said I was much happier now than I ever was with him. He tried to argue, but I told him I had to go and hung up. He didn't call back. 2 weeks after that conversation, my boss called me into her office. I thought I was in trouble for something, but she smiled and told me to sit down. She said the company was creating a new team lead position, and she wanted to offer it to me. The promotion came with a significant raise and more responsibility. She said she had noticed my confidence and leadership skills had improved dramatically over the past year. She asked if I was interested. I said yes before she even finished explaining the details. I left her office and texted Lorraine and Kira the news. They both responded with celebration emojis and demanded we go out to celebrate that weekend. I picked up Nate from daycare that afternoon and told him Mommy got a promotion at work. He asked what that meant, and I explained that it meant I did a good job, and now I would have more important work to do. He said he knew I was good at my job because I was good at everything. I hugged him tight and drove us home to our house, the one that was completely ours, where we were building a life that had nothing to do with Troy's lies or his version of who I was supposed to be. A week after my promotion, Kira pulled me aside after class and asked if I wanted to help teach the beginner self-defense session on Saturday mornings. She said the new students always asked about me and wanted to know my story. She told me I was an inspiration to them, and she thought having me assist would make a real difference. I agreed without thinking twice about it. That first Saturday, I stood in front of 12 women who looked just like I had 3 years ago, nervous and unsure but determined to learn. I showed them basic strikes and blocks while Kira corrected their form. One woman asked me why I started training, and I told her the truth about Troy leaving us during the break-in. I watched their faces change as they realized I wasn't just some fitness person teaching moves. I was someone who actually needed these skills. After class, 3 of them thanked me and said hearing my story made them feel less alone. I drove home feeling like I had found something I was meant to do. The following weekend, Troy was supposed to pick up Nate on Friday evening, but he texted at 4 saying something came up at work and he couldn't make it. Nate shrugged when I told him and asked if his friend from daycare could come over for a sleepover instead. I called the friend's mom and set it up. 2 weeks later, Troy canceled again with the same excuse about work. Nate barely looked up from his coloring book when I told him. He just asked if we could make pancakes for breakfast and watch cartoons all morning. I said yes, and realized my son was completely fine without his father's presence. He had stopped asking when Daddy was coming and stopped talking about their visits unless I brought it up first. 8 months after filing for divorce, I was pushing my cart through the grocery store when I saw Troy in the produce section with a woman I didn't recognize. He had gained at least another 20 pounds, and his face looked puffy and tired. The woman next to him was young, maybe mid-20s, and she kept looking at her phone while Troy picked through the apples. I was wearing my gym clothes after teaching a morning class, and I felt strong and healthy and completely unbothered by seeing him. Troy looked up and made eye contact with me across the vegetables. His expression shifted from surprise to something like embarrassment. He walked over with the woman trailing behind him and tried to start a conversation about how good I looked. I thanked him and kept loading produce into my cart. He introduced the woman as Jennifer, and she gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Troy started talking about the weather and asking about Nate in this fake, casual way that made it clear he was performing for Jennifer. She checked her phone again and touched his arm while saying they needed to get going. Troy nodded and said it was good seeing me. I waved and told them to have a nice day, then went back to my shopping. I felt absolutely nothing about the encounter except maybe a little relief that he was someone else's problem now. I finished my shopping and drove home thinking about what to make for dinner, and Troy didn't cross my mind again. The next month, Nate started kindergarten, and I went to the parent orientation by myself because Troy forgot about it. He sent me a text 2 hours after it ended apologizing and saying work had been crazy. I sat in the classroom with the other parents while the teacher explained the curriculum and daily schedule. A mom next to me asked if my husband couldn't make it, and I told her I was divorced. She nodded like she understood and didn't ask any follow-up questions. The other parents naturally assumed I was a single mom, and I didn't bother explaining the situation because it was basically true anyway. I had been doing everything alone for years, even when Troy lived in the house. The orientation ended, and I collected the papers and forms to fill out at home. Nate ran up to me in the hallway excited about his new classroom and his cubby with his name on it. I took his hand and we walked to the car together, just the two of us like always. That weekend, I packed our bags and drove Nate to the beach 2 hours away. We got a cheap motel room right on the water and spent Saturday building sandcastles and collecting shells. Nate ran back and forth from the water carrying buckets of wet sand for our castle. He found a perfect spiral shell and showed it to me like he had discovered treasure. We ate pizza for dinner and walked on the beach at sunset. Back in the room, Nate laid out all his shells on the bed and told me this was the best vacation ever, because we were happy. I tucked him in and sat on my bed looking at the shells he had arranged by size. I felt something settle in my chest, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The next week, Lorraine came over for coffee and told me I seemed like a completely different person than I was a year ago. She said I was more confident, more at peace, more myself. I thought about her words after she left and realized she was right. I finally felt like the person I was always supposed to be before I spent years trying to manage Troy's ego and protect his feelings. I had built a life that was mine, not one that revolved around someone else's lies and insecurities. I looked around my house with its new locks and security system and felt proud of everything I had created. 2 days later, Troy called while I was making dinner. He asked if we could talk about reducing his child support because he was having financial difficulties. I told him to contact Richard and hung up. Richard called me the next morning and said he had reviewed Troy's financial records that Troy was required to provide. Richard explained that Troy's spending on entertainment and dining out had actually increased over the past few months, not his necessary expenses. Richard told Troy's attorney the answer was no and sent me an email confirming everything. I texted back a thank you and went back to work without giving it another thought. 10 months after filing for divorce, I was teaching my regular Wednesday evening self-defense class when a new student mentioned during the warm-up that her husband kept talking about protecting her, but never actually did anything practical about home security. She said he just made promises and told her not to worry. I shared my story about Troy and the break-in and his pattern of talking big but doing nothing. After class, the new student thanked me and said hearing that helped her see her situation more clearly. 2 other women came up and thanked me for being honest about what I went through. I drove home feeling like my experience was actually helping people, turning something terrible into something useful. The following Monday, Kira called me into her office before class started. She offered me a permanent position as an assistant instructor at the gym. The pay wasn't much, maybe $300 a month, but it was fulfilling work that fit perfectly around my main job and Nate's schedule. I accepted immediately, and Kira smiled and said she knew I would be perfect for it. I taught my class that evening as an official instructor and felt like another piece of my new life had fallen into place. I spent the next week developing the safety plan workshop idea. I called it Family Safety Basics and designed it around practical steps parents could take without needing years of training. The first flyer went up at the gym on Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Kira told me 12 people had signed up. I added a second session for the following week, and that filled up too. The first workshop happened on a Saturday morning in the gym's conference room. Parents arrived with notebooks and worried expressions. I taught them how to create escape routes, where to position phones for emergencies, how to practice with kids without scaring them. A mom in the back row asked what to do if her husband refused to take safety seriously. I told her to prepare anyway and make sure her kids knew the plan. Several people thanked me afterward, and 3 asked when the next session would be. That night, Nate climbed into bed and asked me to check under it for monsters like always. I looked and told him it was clear. He pulled his blanket up and said he liked our house because he knew what to do if something scary happened. I asked him what he meant. He explained that some of his friends at the school didn't have special plans like ours. They didn't know about the bathroom safe spot or how to call for help. He said he felt lucky that I taught him everything. I kissed his forehead and told him I would always make sure he was safe. After he fell asleep, I sat on my bed and felt something warm in my chest that had nothing to do with Troy or the divorce or proving anything. It was just about being the parent Nate needed. 3 days later, I was making dinner when someone knocked on the front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Troy standing on the porch. He hadn't called or texted. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He said he wanted to talk about us and whether we had made a mistake getting divorced. I told him there was no us anymore. There was just a co-parenting arrangement and he needed to call before showing up. He stepped closer and said we should at least discuss it. I reminded him that he needed to call first and started closing the door. He put his hand against it and said we were good together once. I stopped the door and looked at him. I told him we were never good together. He abandoned me and our son during a home invasion. He left a 4-year-old child to face an intruder while he drove away. He stood there for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he dropped his hand and walked back to his car. I closed the door and locked it and went back to making dinner. Nate asked who was at the door, and I told him nobody important. The 1-year mark arrived on a Tuesday. I was teaching 3 classes a week at the gym now. My main job had given me another raise. Nate was happy and doing well in kindergarten. I looked around my house that morning before work and realized my life was exactly what I had built it to be. Every choice I made was mine. Every decision served me and Nate. Troy existed only as a weekend obligation and a child support payment. 2 weeks later, Troy called and asked if he could take Nate for a full week during summer vacation. It was his first time requesting extended parenting time. I asked Nate if he wanted to go, and he got excited about the water park Troy mentioned. I agreed to the week and used the time to visit Lorraine. When Nate came back, he talked about the water slides and the hotel pool. He also said he missed me in our house. Troy admitted while loading Nate's bag into my car that parenting alone for a week was harder than he expected. I smiled and thanked him for bringing Nate home. A woman from the community center called me the next day. She asked if I would be interested in teaching self-defense workshops for their after-school programs. The pay would be decent, and it could lead to more teaching opportunities. I told her I was very interested, and we scheduled a meeting. That fall, Nate and I started creating our own holiday traditions. We decorated cookies together with way too much frosting. We picked out our Christmas tree from the lot down the street. We made hot chocolate and watched movies on Friday nights. Nate never mentioned missing how things used to be with Troy. He just seemed happy with what we had now. On the anniversary of the night Troy hid in the closet, I was teaching my evening class at the gym. We were working on defensive stances, and I was demonstrating proper foot placement. Halfway through the class, I realized I hadn't thought about Troy in days. My life wasn't about what he did or didn't do anymore. It was about the strong, capable person I had become, and the safe, happy home I built for my son and myself. So yeah, that's the whole thing. Nothing too deep, just another random story I somehow turned into a whole video. Thanks for hanging out, it's always chill talking here.